Often when we think about the paranormal and pseudoscience, there's all sorts of topics like ESP, so paranormal ideas about cognition, or good old crop circles, paranormal ideas about agronomy. So there's the awkward moment in the wheat field. Or archaeology, the pyramids were built using advanced alien knowledge. Very important advice. Or paranormal aspects of zoology. And in fact, they want me to do a skeptics talk next year, so maybe I could do a specific a cryptozoology one or something like that. But what I wanted to talk about today is paranormal aspects in the earth sciences. And there is some overlap in there between the paranormal earth sciences and some other aspects. So in particular here was a poll from I think a couple years ago, so this is the 60-degree mark to give us an orientation. And the highest one here in terms of belief is the percentage of Americans who believe we can influence the physical world via positive thought. And the next one down believed advanced civilizations like Atlantis once existed. And that ties into today's topic. Whereas, down here we have, only about 28% are confident that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. So yeah, we're looking at paranormal concepts about the nature of the planet Earth. And we'll start with something that's fairly mundane, and in its initial phases wasn't obviously incorrect. And that's true of some of these. As you'll see in some of these other cases, when the ideas were initially proposed, they were obviously incorrect. But in this case, it wasn't. And this is the story of Atlantis. So Plato is our initial author of the story of Atlantis, and it's actually described in two of the dialogues, in the Critias and the Timaeus, which are two of the later dialogues. There was going to be, scholars are fairly certain he was going to have an end part to the trilogy, and I can't remember the name of which of the people that he was having the dialogue with it would be, but that is known. And it's described in this, and he gives certain characteristics of this place he's describing called Atlantis. He said it existed 9,000 years ago, from his time. So that would be what? Add 2.5 millennia to that. It was said to be a large island, larger than Africa plus Asia combined. But keep in mind, the word Africa would describe sort of the northern part of Africa, Libya basically today. And Asia would be basically Anatolia. Still a sizable landmass, but a large island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, normally interpreted as being the Rock of Gibraltar and its counterpart in Africa, so outside the Mediterranean. And it's described as an island nation which had conquered the other islands in the Ocean Sea, in the Atlantic, as well as the western and southern part of the Mediterranean lands, as close to Greece as Egypt in the south and Tyrrhenia, Italy, in the north. And specifically, it was opposed by an Athens, which he said existed 9,000 years before his time. That was the great rival of Atlantis, is that Athens existed at that time, an earlier Athens. And that was sort of the point of the story, is that Athens, standing alone, defeated them and liberated the Mediterranean from the rule of the Atlanteans. And then there was a huge cataclysm, and in a day and a night, the entire Athenian army was swallowed up by the earth, and the land of Atlantis sank beneath the waves. That's the story, or those are the major parts of the story. Now, people will talk about the myth of Atlantis, but it's important to point out this is not a myth. It is not coming out of the corpus of common beliefs in traditional Greek mythology. It is not a legend. There aren't stories of a particular hero and his deeds. And importantly, there is not a single mention of Atlantis prior to the existence of Plato. Not a single one. Despite the fact we have historians in Greek literature who were writing about the history of the world prior to that. They're not mentioning it. So no mention prior to Plato. We don't see it in Greek histories. We don't see it in Egyptian histories, despite the fact in the Critias and the Timaeus, Plato says that this story was transmitted, and he tells a series of people, including Solon the Great, who heard it from Egyptian priests. But the Egyptian records don't talk about it. The Babylonian literature doesn't talk about it. And in fact, this is Plato being Plato. He's using it as a case study. And he's using it as, I don't know if allegory, allegory is not a bad word for this kind, an allegory for how, he says specifically, wouldn't it be interesting to see how an ideal state would act against an overwhelming power? And then he goes, and then one of his, in this story, either Critias or Timaeus says, you know, my father heard a story from his grandfather who heard a story that Athens existed 9,000 years ago in, amazing coincidence, the ideal state you're describing. And it faced an overwhelming power and yet won the day. So there are some people who would say, well, Plato couldn't come up with this idea on his own. To which I say, huh? I mean, we're in Balticon here. We know that human imagination is actually pretty big, and people can come up with great concepts. We have imaginative people, and it's not like that was invented in 1950. You know, it wasn't invented in the 19th century. There were very clever people in the past, and I think we all acknowledge Plato was one of the cleverest, yeah.
We even have a term for this, it's alternative history.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. It's an alternative history. And we know that Plato would come up with really imaginative concepts and scenarios in other of his work. For example, in the Symposium on Love, he has various people in the dialogues give how did love come to be, and they each tell a story, and these aren't stories that are coming from the corpus of mythology that we know of from other writers. It's Plato came up with it himself. Probably the best, the most famous modern version of one of those stories is if you've ever seen Hedwig and the Angry Inch. A core aspect of that comes from one of the stories in Plato's Symposium on Love. So, people would talk about Atlantis on and off from Plato's time. So from that point on, it does become part of the discourse of people. Some people saying Plato imagined the whole thing, others saying, no, it must be real. And it goes on and on throughout later antiquity, in the Middle Ages, into early modern times and so forth. And especially the sort of a modern incarnation of Atlantis really comes out of America, and that's through this guy, Congressman Ignatius Donnelly. He was a member of the Minnesota House of Representatives, later the Minnesota Senate. He was a U.S. Congressman for Minnesota, part of the Radical Republican Party, or the Radical Republican section of the Republican Party, and was eventually lieutenant governor of Minnesota. So not a minor figure of his time, at least locally. But he's remembered today, I think, mostly because of his writing of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and he actually had a sequel about Ragnarok. He actually started to incorporate the science that was coming out at the time, including the oceanography. People were now doing sounding expeditions in various parts of the world. We had an idea of what the depth of the ocean could be. And here was his body. He pictured, here's Atlantis, because there's a profile of the Atlantic, and that's the Bermudas here and Madeira over here. And there's the Azores. And he identified, here it is. It's Dolphin's Ridge. This is actually Atlantis. But more so than indicating where he thought Atlantis was his idea of what Atlantis meant for the history of humanity. Because he came up with this idea that Atlantis was sort of the founder culture for most of the rest of the world. That Plato was correct both in its age, that it existed about 9,000 years before Plato, and its position, that it was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which meant the Atlantic Ocean. But he had it colonized many, many parts of the world. The areas in white were the regions that he interpreted as being colonies of Atlantis. So it was the ancestral homeland for what was interpreted at the time as the Aryan and the Semitic peoples. We now recognize these as language groups. They're not ethnic groups. But this is, the 19th century. People are still thinking that these are actual lineages of people. He considered the religion of Egypt and the Inca, at least as well as known as they were in the 19th century, as being direct survivors of Atlantean sun worship, that the Atlanteans were sun worshippers. That the pagan gods that we read of in Norse and Greek and Phoenician and so forth mythology were just mythologized versions of the kings and queens of Atlantis. And that these various spots showed you here were colonies of the Atlanteans, that they were the culture bringers, that the rest of the world was in a savage state, that culture basically began in Atlantis, and it spread out from there, and the Atlanteans were the foundation of all high civilizations, from his point of view. But then it was, in fact, destroyed by terrible convulsions, and that survivors who happened to have been on boats or in the colonies or whatever misremembered this over time, and this became the story that among the Jews were remembered as the Great Flood, and the Greeks as Deucalion's flood, and as Atlantis separately, and so on and so forth. And then a lot of writers, both people who thought they were writing nonfiction and fiction writers, picked up on this. And so the antediluvian world actually was very influential, inspired a lot of later people. The Theosophists, I'll talk about the Theosophists in a bit. They are a religious movement of the late 19th, early 20th century. Edgar Allan Poe refers to this. I didn't mention it, but Jules Verne, his view of Atlantis comes in part from this. The psychic Edward Casey, his vision of Atlantis is really a Donnelly version. Donovan, the Donovan song of Atlantis was basically a Donnelly version of Atlantis, and it inspired someone near and dear to the hearts of a lot of us here, J.R.R. Tolkien and the story of Númenor. Númenor itself, remember, Númenor after the fall is known in, is it Kenya or Sindarin as Atalante, the Downfallen. There was no hiding it. Tolkien intended Númenor to have been his Atlantis myth, and it's what was misremembered by later people as Atlantis. And it's Donnelly's Atlantis in many ways. Númenor is the founder of high civilization among men around the world. And they themselves carrying on the tradition of the First Age elves, but spreading it to savage people around the world. Eventually, though, Númenor collapsing, but having found many colonies, of which Gondor and Arnor were two of the last. They had founded many other colonies. If you actually get into the Silmarillion and the Akallabeth primarily, there were many other colonies in all the continents of the world that the Númenorians had founded, but all of them, other than Gondor and Arnor, eventually fell into darkness, as Atlantis itself, as Númenor itself did, and the Valar, they say, hey, boss, we're not dealing with this anymore, and Eru and God, knocks Númenor off the face of the earth and decides, hey, this whole flat earth is a bad idea, let's make it a sphere. So people have been trying to place where Atlantis went throughout history. This is actually from an early modern work by Rubek, a Swedish author who amazingly decided it was in Sweden. But people had said, okay, well, maybe beyond the Pillars of Heracles doesn't mean what the words actually say they mean. So maybe it's actually within the Mediterranean. And so people have spotted it at various locations here, or other people, yes, it's outside the Pillars, but maybe it's other spots around the world, in the New World, or Antarctica, or Sweden, and so forth. So a common trope in late 20th century, or mid to late 20th century discussions is that it is actually supposed to represent Thera, or now call it Santorini, an island in the Mediterranean, which went foom. The central core of the volcano, you can see it right there. These are the edges of the caldera after the huge eruption within early historic times. And although this may have inspired sort of mimetically the idea of great disasters, it's important to go back and look at what Plato actually wrote about Atlantis. And other than the great disaster aspect of it, it doesn't seem to have been a primary inspiration to it. This wasn't its own culture. This wasn't a dominant power that faced an Athens that existed, thousands of years before Athens existed and so forth. So it may have been in part an inspiration, but I think it's incorrect to say Thera was Atlantis. There was no Atlantis outside the brain of Plato. But he gave us a great idea, and an idea that's lived through the ages. Of course, there are no spaces for continents in the deep sea now. We now know the deep sea much better than we used to, and despite what they'll say on Animal Planet, we actually know the deep sea extraordinarily well. It's what we don't know it is down to a very small, fine-grained level, but we know the big pattern super, super duper well. And this is the one part of the ocean we know really super duper, uber duper well. Because a lot of the techniques used to do deep sea research has been done in the northern Atlantic and central Atlantic before anywhere else. So there is no spot for a continental mass in here. We know that. And continental rock and oceanic rock are radically different from each other. We don't actually have space for continents in there. That's not to say that there aren't some submerged continental rocks, as I'll show in a bit, but there is no space for a very, very large Atlantis out in the Atlantic. Now, Atlantis is sort of less famous, but still in science fiction and fantasy circles, not unfamous cousin is Lemuria. And this is one where we most definitely know where the concept came from because it's an actual journal article that you can find in the Quarterly Journal of Science by this guy, P.L. Slater, who was a biogeographer of the 19th century. And he was trying to describe how he interpreted the distribution of certain types of animals and plants that were common to the Indian Ocean region. And so he's talking about a long sentence here, but the anomalies of the mammal fauna of Madagascar can best be explained by supposing that anterior to the existence of Africa in its present shape, a large continent occupied parts of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans stretching out towards what is now America to the west, and to India and its islands to the east. And blah, 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 blah. For which I should propose the name Lemuria. We know where this word comes from. It's his paper, and it means land of lemurs. That's exactly where the word Lemuria comes from. So when you've got, if you go to your psychic, I remember when I was in Lemuria, that's funny that they happened to know back then what the biogeographer was going to name it in the 19th century. Now, the idea of sunken land masses was actually the par for the course in geology and biogeography in the 19th century. So prior to the recognition that continental masses can move laterally, how do you explain discordant distribution of organisms or rocks in the geologic record or the present world? Well, one idea is that what is currently under the waves may have once been above the water. We know the reverse is true to some degree because we'll find oceanic rock, or at least aquatic rock, marine rock, on the continents. You go to the Cretaceous rocks in the middle of Kansas, and it's ocean rocks. You go to the top of Mount Everest, and it's shallow marine limestones. So people thought perhaps, we know that oceanic rock can be pushed upwards. Maybe stuff that's in the deep sea was once above the waves. And so biogeographers, paleogeographers came up with ideas of alternative shapes of continents, thinking that the latitude and longitude coordinates of any particular spot on the Earth haven't changed, but what's changed is the vertical displacement. And so, for instance, right here, this would be a version of Lemuria connecting Madagascar and India. And here's yet another incarnation from other works, ideas of transoceanic land bridges. That's another thing. We know that land bridges exist and have a semi-ephemeral nature, the Isthmus of Panama being the most famous example of that. The Isthmus of Panama didn't exist before about 15 million years ago, only fully formed by 3 million years ago. So we know such things could exist. And before the deep sea was mapped out to the degree it was and sampled by drilling, we didn't know there weren't continental rocks down there. And so this idea was certainly a reasonable one given the nature of the science at the time. But the science of the 20th century showed, no, this is incorrect, that most oceanic rock is a thin crust of basalt, of volcanic rock. It doesn't have the continental rock composition. When we map out the surface of it, we don't see these spots, and instead what we find out is that the continents themselves and the oceanic rock are moving horizontally more so than moving vertically, that plate tectonics is in operation. But before that idea was there, this Lemurian concept, the sunken continent idea, was part of the mainstay of a lot of research. So here was from a Huxley paper based on work by Haeckel before him, and there's Lemuria. He doesn't actually give a geography for it, he's showing modern geography, but here's the idea that Lemuria may have been the homeland for the ancestral people that then distributed around the world. So this is not intended to be a paranormal research. This is a mainstay scientific paper at the time. But in the late 19th and early 20th century, Lemuria was claimed by part of the New Age movement. And anyone who thinks that the New Age movement is new has to go back and look at sort of the history of religious ideas over time. Almost anything you find in the New Age movement of the 1980s and 90s was present in the 80s and 90s, the 1880s and the 1890s. And a real founder of these ideas was Madame Blavatsky, who developed a new religion at the time called Theosophy. And here are some of the volumes that came out from that. And Blavatsky wanted to incorporate the new discoveries of science of the late 19th century. This included evolution, geologic time, philology, the history of languages, and so forth. That she felt that earlier religions, because they didn't incorporate that, people weren't going to pay attention to them. So she tried to work that into this new religion. So it's a religion that accepts the change of that humans today were not always of the shape that they are now. The continents today weren't always the shape they were then, and so forth. But she didn't actually ground all that stuff and check it by the science of the time. Yeah?
Was Doggerland known of at the time that Lemuria was being hypothesized?
Yes, and I'll have a picture of Doggerland coming up as a real example of it. That's a good example, yeah. So here was, not from her, but one of her disciples, a map of Lemuria at its greatest extent. So this would be the Lemurian region. And this particular view of Lemuria as a place where ancient cultures that weren't quite human, this made its way into popular culture. So people like Edgar Rice Burroughs and so forth started to incorporate that. Eventually, Marvel Comics, the Marvel Universe, has Lemuria as well as Atlantis in there as rival powers and so forth. And in fact, in the Theosophist view, we are just the latest incarnation of people, that the first people were ethereal. They didn't have physical form. And then there was the race of Hyperborea. You may recognize these terms showing up in the writings of other authors of the early 20th century. And then the Lemurian people, and then the Atlanteans, and then finally, we are the fifth root race. Now, there are real sunken land bridges and real drowned continental regions. And Doggerland, as mentioned, is one example of that. At the height of the last ice age, which coincidentally, probably, almost certainly, would have been about the time that Atlantis sank. So the peak of the last ice age was about 18,000 to 14,000 years ago. And the big deglaciation, the big meltback begins about 12,000, 11,000 years ago. When all that ice is bound up when all that water is bound up in continental ice, that means sea level's lower. As that ice melts, water floods and covers the land. So there were points when much of the land in the North Sea was above sea level. And so it was an inhabitable region. There was no English Channel. There was sort of English Channel River that would have been there. Similarly, in North America, we would be able, you'd go to Ocean City or Atlantic City, and then you'd have to drive for another hour or so to get to the beach. Beringia, another famous example of that. The water between Siberia and Alaska is very shallow, and as the ice builds up on the continents, sea level drops, and animals, including humans, could migrate back and forth between Asia and North America, and you could see Russia from there at the time. And it doesn't have to be in a cold area. The sea level drop is global. What we say is a eustatic sea level drop. And so during the glacial maxima, when glaciers are at the largest extent, Tasmania, Australia, and New Guinea are one landmass, and the name given to that landmass is Sahul. And a large part of the Malay archipelago is also connected by land, and this is called Sunda or Sundaland. So it is true there are spaces that do get covered up by water as the ice melts and drowned. These happened before written records, but they are something that have happened within the history of humanity.
What are all those lines that were?
Oh, these lines, so these are various biogeographic lines where we see in different groups of organisms, animals and plants and so forth, the influence of Asia versus Australia within Indonesia. In some places, the Asian animals get further into the archipelago, and in other places, they're closer to the mainland of Asia. And the Wallace, the Weber, and Lydekker lines are just different barriers there that we've seen. Well, absolutely, yeah. Florida, as the ice melts, Florida, other than the very northern part of the state, you don't have much of Florida left. And here's actually a fairly large continental mass, Zealandia. Most of Zealandia is underwater. Only the islands of New Zealand are still above water. Now, this is actually a much more recent flooding, a more ancient flooding event. It's been sinking down for a while, but just goes to show that, yes, there is, to some degree, the rise and fall of land masses. And in honor of our main guest of honor at the convention, there is a drowned land bridge between Westeros and Essos. And it's in the books, that the arm of Dorne, so the peninsula on which Dorne is on, was once connected about a couple 10,000 years ago or 11,000 years ago, something of that nature, with Essos. And in the war between the first men and the children of the forest, when the first men migrated into what we now call Westeros, the children of the forest called upon the gods to smash and break the arm of Dorne, and there's only a small archipelago, the Stepstones, left in between. And if you've read The World of Ice and Fire, the compilation of the history, so there are maesters who saying, clearly this is since magic isn't real, clearly this is just a folk retelling, and simply it was the rise of sea level which flooded these lowlands. So now moving from sunken continents to the hollow earth. The idea that that the earth is hollow beneath our feet, or else we'll see there's even more radical suggestions. There's all sorts of different people who have come up with hollow earth ideas, sort of a compilation of a bunch of different ones. The idea of chambers beneath our feet in a spherical earth goes back some way. So here's from 1664, Kircher's Mundus Subterraneus, one of the great works of geology of the 1600s, and an attempt to explain what we can now use geophysics to explain with the science at the time. And so recognizing that there are these volcanoes, that we have fire coming out of the earth, there must be chambers of fire inside the earth. And instead of thinking of shells, he thought there were pockets of different sorts of heat that eventually would emerge on the surface of the earth as fire. But we also know that water comes out of the earth. We have springs. So there's also chambers of water. And the water comes out at various spots. And in fact, he used this to explain where the fire pockets and the water pockets meet. That's where we get hot springs. But where it's just water pockets, that's where we get cold springs. So not a bad idea, given that everything underneath the feet was, literally terra incognita. It's an attempt to explain things. Now, a more radical idea about the hollow earth came from this gentleman, Edmund Halley, much more famous for something else he discovered. Great mathematician, great astronomer, and so forth. And here's a picture of him early in life, and here he is late in life. And he thought the thing to highlight his work is he's holding in his hand a picture of the hollow earth. And so this is Halley's model. It's actually, in order to save printing costs in the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, they actually had two separate papers using the same figure space. So one had to do with sound and music, and the other had to do with his idea. So he's not saying that this is the music of the spheres or whatever, but although, it kind of works well. And his idea was that the Earth was comprised of 3 shells and a solid core, and that there's air in between them. And the shells were, in his opinion, about the size of Venus and Mars, and then the core would be about the size of the moon. Now, he didn't get the values quite right. Those of you who know your astronomy, the shell that would represent Venus would be almost as big as the shell that's the Earth, but at the time, they didn't really have those values down that well. The reason for him thinking that the Earth was hollow and that it had these separate shells that were moving independently of each other was to explain the migration of the magnetic pole of the Earth. So he thought, we had already observed by his time period that the magnetic pole was beginning to shift around. And so how do we explain that? Well, there was no way to actually sample the material beneath his feet to great depth. So given a lack of data, this might be an explanation. The math works out kind of, sort of. And he pointed to Saturn and said, look, here we've got an example of a ring that can orbit a planet without touching it anywhere. So why could it not be that shells are orbiting each other inside the Earth? And he said, well, if so, they might be inhabited. Why would God create such great amount of space and then not inhabit it? But if it's inhabited, there must be some sort of source of light, and he didn't know what that might be, so he thought maybe there's like glowing vegetation down there, or the rocks were giving off gases that glowed, or whatever. Now that idea was out there, but he didn't do that much with it. However, our more modern concept, if that's the appropriate term, of hollow earths really stems from this guy, Sims, another American. So Captain John Cleves Sims of the US Army. Is his dates, late 1700s, early 1800s. He served in the War of 1812. Went on speaking tours and writing tours describing his idea that the Earth is hollow, and he would point to people like Halley and some other researchers. And he thought it was habitable within, with a number of solid concentric spheres, one within the other. And here was his new contribution, that is open at the poles at about 12 to 16 degrees. He pledges his life in support of this truth and is ready to explore the hollow earth if the world will support and aid him in this undertaking. Now consider the time he's living in. Lewis and Clark have just gone on their great expedition and showed all this great new land for America. He said, I can find America land too, inside the earth. And so he thought, depending upon where he was in his writing, that there were as many as 5 internested spheres. Later on, he got down to maybe it's just 1 sphere. His innovation were what became known as Sims holes, which are big openings at the top of the planet. He thought that the northern lights were actually reflections into the atmosphere of the internal radiance of the Earth, shining outward.
It's a proto-Death Star.
Yeah, there we go. Yes, that's no moon. It's the Earth. And so, he was encouraging a voyage of discovery to go there. And so here's a model from Simsonia, the great compilation of his work, and that parts of it might be illuminated by the sun and the moon, depending upon when we are in the seasons, but the rest of it might have to be illuminated by a great central sun. Now, those of you who know your Edgar Rice Burroughs and so forth know that Pellucidar and other internal world stories really draw directly out of this, an inhabited internal Earth of probably eternal sunlight, because the sun is shining there all the time. And so here's actually from long after his death. This is in Harper's Magazine. They're still talking about it. Here's a Sims hole, as it would appear to a lunarian with a telescope. So now we're going to move from the reasonable to a really weird idea. This is Cyrus Tweed, or as he asked his followers to call him, Koresh. That's almost never a good thing if you know your recent history. Was a quack cure physician and mystic. He founded a religion which he modestly called Koreshanity. And they actually were one of these utopian religions and communities. They set up a utopian home in Estero, Florida. And he held that the world was hollow and concave. And that when we look up, we're seeing a spheroid of various compositions where light paths travel in all these sorts of weird curves. And yeah, here's another model of it. There's the sky above us. And that the moon, the full moon, is a reflection of the Earth below, distorted as we look up. And the planets are optical illusions. And yeah, it's like, yes. The Earth is not convex, the so-called proof of convexity. Now, he actually, to give him credit, he wanted to test this hypothesis. So he had his community build the rectilineator. And this was going to be this long, extended, straight pole. And what they thought is if you kept on doing it, you do it at however many feet it was, and then you put the second one over here, and you disassemble this one and go on, and as long as you keep it level, if the Earth is convex, eventually it's going to get higher and higher above the land. But if the Earth is concave, eventually you're going to encounter the land. So he had his team go out there, and here they are setting up the rectilineator and working on it. And lo and behold, he never actually had it do either. It always stayed sort of level. And that was kind of puzzling. And he says that doesn't follow either model. And now, of course, the thing is the tolerances on this, this is wood and metal, and it's just going to flex a little bit, and a little flexion over a long period of time is going to keep things sort of level. But at least give him credit. He was trying to test his hypothesis.
Well, what was he using to test what level was? Because he was using a bubble level or something like that, or a drop level, or anything. It's going to point to the
center. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There are lots of issues with this idea. Yeah. So, and now for something really weird. Okay, we're going to start with something that actually isn't particularly strange, and these are nummulidids. Nummulidids are a type of calcareous plankton. Well, calcareous is actually not plankton, they're benthos. They're macroscopic unicellular protists. They're, in fact, specifically a group called the foraminiferans. Foraminiferans are sort of armored amoebas. They are a single-celled organism that played out a shell of calcium carbonate, of Tums, and they live inside that in little pseudopods which they grab particles of food. Now, there are many types of forams which are planktonic. They actually float in the water, and many types which are benthic, that live on the seafloor. And my plantcon, or plankton, that I referred to was actually a cheat, because these are benthic ones. And they're benthic because they're huge. These are definitely macroscopic organisms, even though they're unicellular. They cheat. They have multiple nuclei. They are common in the Eocene to Miocene in shallow water sediments. We do have close relatives of them today, which are macroscopic. They're among the largest single-celled organisms out there. And they were so common in the Eocene to the Miocene, particularly in what's called the Tethyan region, sort of the Indian Ocean plus Mediterranean region, that there are many limestones where the primary component are nummulidids. Now, part of that area, to tie things to ancient Egypt, some of that limestone became a large part of the components of the limestone of the Great Pyramids. Uh-oh. Yeah, so you actually have these limestones where you could see these macroscopic disc-shaped objects. And some of the Greek writers referred to this. They said, we visited these ancient ruins, we looked at their surface, and you could see the lentils that the slaves who built the pyramids were eating that were baked to stone in the hot Egyptian sun. So that's the oldest record we have of forams in the rock record, and they're nummulidids. They're fairly big. I mean, they can be the size of quarters. Many of them are small, but they can be the size of quarters. They're quite impressive objects. That actually is that's an oyster, but and they're actually quite beautiful in cross section. They have multiple chambers within them, and so here's a limestone where they've planed off the surface. And in fact, there are many specialists in forams, because they're very useful. They do evolve at relatively rapid rates, and they were very common. So they're useful for indicating moments in geologic time and paleo environments and so forth. So there are all sorts of specialists in carbonate geology who look at forams of various sorts, including nummulidids. And one such person was Randolph Kirkpatrick, worked for the Natural History Museum in London. He was their foram worker. Who, in his own work in the published journals, was a reasonable person, but on his own developed a radical new hypothesis. Because what happened was he started to see nummulidids everywhere. Everywhere. And so here's his book. Yes, it's so-called igneous. Here's the Nummulosphere, an account of the organic origin of so-called igneous rocks and the abyssal red clays. So here he was looking at a sand grain, a silica sand grain, and looking inside of it, he said, look, I can see the nummulidids. And here he drew them. Here's inside volcanic rock. And look, he could see the nummulidids. They were there. And here it is in a piece of granite. And inside diamond. And inside a meteorite. And so he became convinced, because he was literally seeing them everywhere, he became convinced that these objects, that everything was made of nummulidids. Everything was made of nummulidids. And so he thought that, that igneous rocks were just sort of melted nummulidids. And that siliciclastic sedimentary rocks, so sand grains and so forth, that would make a sandstone, those were derived from igneous rocks, which themselves were nummulidids. Now, he wasn't quite willing to say, and I was sort of misleading by saying a universe made of plankton. When he said that meteorites were made of nummulidids as well, he actually thought that meteorites had to have been terrestrial, that they were volcanic rocks that were blown up and came back down, because he said, well, we all know that none of the other worlds are inhabited. So that would be crazy to think there were nummulidids in other planets. So they were just chunks of Earth rock made of nummulidids that were blown up and came back down. So instead of the standard model rock cycle that I teach my students and so forth, here was this new version. Everything is made of plankton. You never know. The world can be very different from certain points of view, and these are just some examples of people who've come up with some radical new ideas. So I thank you guys for showing up.